The war in Europe was supposed to be over. Berlin was already burning, Hitler was dead, and the German armies were collapsing in every direction. After nearly 6 years of bloodshed, the world expected relief. Soldiers expected rest. Civilians expected peace. But inside Allied headquarters, peace was not the word on everyone's mind. General George S. Patton stood over a map of Europe, tracing lines with his finger, his voice sharp, impatient. To him, this was not the end of the war. This was a pause, a dangerous one. "Berlin," he said. "We should take Berlin, now." To Patton, the logic was simple. His armies were moving fast. German resistance was crumbling. The Red Army was still weeks away from full control. If the Western Allies moved immediately, Berlin could fall into American hands. Not tomorrow, not someday, now. But across the Atlantic, Winston Churchill felt a chill run through him when Patton's words reached London, because Churchill understood something Patton either ignored or refused to accept. If American tanks marched on Berlin, the war might not end at all. This was not a disagreement about a city, it was a disagreement about the future of the world. And what Churchill said in response was never meant to inspire headlines or speeches. It was a warning, quiet, calculated, and terrifying in its implications. To understand why this moment mattered, you have to understand the world as it existed in the final days of the Second World War. Germany was collapsing faster than anyone had predicted. Entire units surrendered without firing a shot. Cities fell in days. Roads were packed with refugees, prisoners, and retreating soldiers who knew the war was lost. The Nazi state was imploding from the inside. But while Germany was dying, something else was being born. The alliance that had defeated Hitler was already breaking apart. The United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union had fought together out of necessity, not trust. They shared an enemy, not a vision. And now that enemy was disappearing. For years, the cracks had been hidden beneath the urgency of survival. But with victory in sight, those cracks widened into fractures. Stalin wanted security and control. Eastern Europe was already falling under Soviet influence, one capital at a time. Poland, Romania, Hungary. Each step westward tightened Moscow's grip. The Americans wanted the war to end cleanly. Bring the troops home. Avoid another generation of graves. They believed cooperation, however uneasy, was still possible. Churchill was caught in between. He distrusted Stalin deeply, perhaps more than anyone else at the table. He had warned for years that Soviet expansion would replace one tyranny with another. And yet, he also understood the limits of British power. Britain was exhausted. Its cities were scarred by bombing. Its economy was drained. Another massive war, especially against a former ally, could destroy the empire forever. And then there was Patton. To Patton, the situation looked very different. He did not see a fragile peace. He saw a missed opportunity forming in real time. Patton believed the Soviets were the next enemy, not someday, but inevitably. He believed every mile the Red Army advanced would be paid for later in American blood. And he believed history would judge harshly those who hesitated when action was possible. Berlin, in his mind, was not just a symbol, it was leverage. Whoever took it would shape the post-war world. And Patton was not alone in thinking this. Quietly, among officers and planners, the question was already circulating. If the Allies stopped now, would they regret it later? Maps were studied, timelines calculated, casualties estimated. This was the moment where victory could harden into dominance or dissolve into vulnerability. Churchill knew all of this. He also knew something else. Marching on Berlin would not be a political decision. It would be a declaration, not against Germany, against the Soviet Union. And once that line was crossed, there would be no going back. What made this moment so dangerous was not that Patton was wrong, but that he might have been right at the worst possible time. Because if the Western Allies took Berlin, Stalin would not simply accept it. He had sacrificed millions of lives to reach that city. He would not be denied it without consequence. Churchill could already see the next steps unfolding in his mind. Escalating demands, military standoffs, armies facing each other not as allies, but as enemies. A new war, born from the ashes of the old one. And unlike the last, this one would be fought with weapons the world had never seen. Patton saw speed as salvation. Churchill saw speed as catastrophe. And somewhere between them, history hesitated. What happened next would determine not just who occupied Berlin, but whether the Second World War truly ended at all. George Smith Patton was not a man who waited for permission. He believed hesitation was weakness, caution was decay, and history favored those who moved first and struck hardest. To Patton, war was not chaos, it was a test of will, and he had spent his entire life preparing to win it. By the spring of 1945, Patton had become exactly the kind of commander the United States needed to defeat Germany. Aggressive, relentless, unapologetically confident. His Third Army had ripped through France after D-Day, moving faster than Allied planners believed possible. When others slowed, Patton accelerated. He didn't just defeat German forces, he broke them psychologically. Prisoners surrendered en masse when they heard his name. German officers warned their men about Patton as if he were a force of nature rather than a general. To his soldiers, he was terrifying and magnetic. But what made Patton dangerous now was not his talent. It was his worldview. Patton did not see the Soviet Union as a partner. He saw it as the next battlefield. Long before Allied leaders openly discussed post-war tensions, Patton had already made up his mind. He believed the Red Army was occupying Eastern Europe not as a liberator, but as a conqueror. And he believed that once Germany was gone, the only thing preventing another war was illusion. In his private writings, Patton was blunt to the point of recklessness. He argued that the United States was making a historic mistake by stopping short, that the Soviets understood only strength, that if they were not confronted immediately, they would push west until someone finally resisted, at far greater cost. To Patton, timing was everything. The American army was fully mobilized, battle-hardened, supplied, confident. The Soviet army, though massive, was exhausted. Millions of casualties had bled it white. Its logistics were stretched thin across devastated territory. Patton believed this imbalance would never exist again. If there was ever a moment to decide the shape of the post-war world, it was now. While American tanks were already rolling and American soldiers were already in Europe. Waiting, in Patton's mind, was the most dangerous option of all. He also believed something else that few were willing to say out loud. Patton believed the war had ended too early. Not in victory, but in clarity. Germany was defeated, yes, but the ideological war, the one that truly mattered, was unresolved. Fascism was gone, but communism remained, stronger than ever, armed, organized, and sitting in the heart of Europe. To Patton, stopping now meant postponing the inevitable. And postponement, he believed, would only make the next war worse. This belief shaped everything he did in those final weeks. He studied Soviet movements closely. He compared troop strengths. He asked uncomfortable questions during briefings, questions others avoided. What happens if the Soviets don't leave? What happens if they refuse free elections? What happens if we let them take Berlin uncontested? Patton's answers were always the same. We will regret it. And because Patton was Patton, he didn't keep these thoughts to himself. He spoke openly, sometimes recklessly, to fellow officers. He voiced frustration with Allied restrictions. He complained that politics were interfering with military logic. To him, Berlin was not a diplomatic bargaining chip. It was a military objective that should already be under American control. This made him both influential and dangerous. Influential because many soldiers quietly agreed with him. Dangerous because Patton did not understand restraint or accept it. To Winston Churchill, this was deeply troubling. Churchill respected Patton's brilliance. He understood the appeal of decisive action, but he also knew something Patton did not. Wars are not ended by generals alone. They are ended by consequences. And Patton, in Churchill's eyes, was charging toward consequences he refused to fully imagine. What frightened Churchill most was not Patton's aggression. It was his conviction. Patton was not improvising. He was not bluffing. He genuinely believed that history would vindicate him. that future generations would curse those who hesitated while the opportunity existed. And when a man like Patton believes that, he doesn't simply argue, he acts. By late April 1945, Patton was no longer just thinking about Berlin, he was preparing. Patton's plan did not begin as a formal proposal. It began as a question, asked quietly, then repeated, then refined. How fast could we get there? By late April 1945, Patton's Third Army was deep inside Germany. Resistance was uneven, often collapsing altogether. Entire German units surrendered the moment American armor appeared. Roads were open. Bridges were still standing. Fuel and ammunition were flowing. Speed was no longer a theory, it was a reality. Patton began running the numbers. If his forces pushed northeast instead of stopping at the agreed lines, Berlin was within reach, not weeks away, days. The Soviets were advancing from the east, but they were paying a brutal price for every mile. Urban fighting slowed them down. Their supply lines were long and fragile. Their troops were exhausted after years of relentless combat. Patton saw a window, narrow but real. The official Allied agreements placed Berlin inside the Soviet occupation zone. On paper, that settled the matter. In reality, Patton believed paper meant nothing once the shooting stopped. Cities were not awarded by ink, they were taken by men, and Patton had men ready to move. What made his thinking especially dangerous was that it was not reckless, it was calculated. Patton understood that taking Berlin would violate agreements made with the Soviets, but he also understood something else. Possession would change everything. Once American troops occupied the city, no one would realistically force them out. Berlin would become a bargaining chip too valuable to ignore. The presence of American forces there would limit Soviet expansion, shape post-war negotiations, and signal that the United States was not willing to concede Europe by default. Patton also believed the psychological impact would be decisive. Berlin was the heart of the Nazi regime, but it was also the symbol of victory in Europe. Whoever raised their flag there would define the narrative of the war's end. To Patton, allowing the Soviets to claim that moment uncontested was not just symbolic weakness, it was strategic failure. Behind closed doors, Patton pushed harder. He argued that Allied soldiers were already dying unnecessarily by stopping short. He questioned why American forces should halt while the Soviets continued advancing. He challenged the logic of respecting future agreements when present realities could still be shaped. More controversially, Patton believed manpower was not the problem. In one of his most alarming ideas, he suggested that surrendered German soldiers could be rearmed and used to help stabilize Europe, even to counter Soviet forces if necessary. To him, yesterday's enemy could become tomorrow's asset. This was not idle talk. Patton saw former Wehrmacht units not as Nazis, but as disciplined soldiers who understood how to fight the Red Army. He believed ideology mattered less than alignment. To many, this idea crossed an invisible line. To Patton, it was simply pragmatism. If the goal was to prevent Soviet domination of Europe, then sentimentality had no place in planning. The more Patton spoke, the clearer it became that his vision extended beyond Berlin. Berlin was the first step. If confrontation came, Patton wanted it on ground of his choosing, at a time when American forces held the advantage. He believed delaying that confrontation would only make the Soviets stronger and the West weaker. But here was the problem. Patton did not command the war alone. Every mile his army advanced was tied to political decisions made far above his rank. Decisions shaped not by battlefield momentum, but by global consequences. And those consequences were beginning to weigh heavily on Winston Churchill. Churchill was receiving reports of Patton's thinking, not all of them formal. Some came as warnings, whispered concerns, uneasy observations passed along through diplomatic and military channels. What troubled Churchill was not the feasibility of Patton's plan, it was its inevitability, if left unchecked. Because once soldiers start believing that restraint is betrayal, control becomes fragile. And Churchill knew that if Patton was allowed to move on Berlin, events would outrun diplomacy. The moment American troops crossed that line, every promise made to Stalin would collapse. Trust, already thin, would evaporate overnight. The alliance would not crack, it would shatter. And in its place would stand two armed camps, staring at each other across the ruins of Europe, waiting for the next order. Patton believed that order was coming anyway. Churchill feared that giving it would unleash something no one could stop. This was no longer a debate about tactics. It was a race between momentum and restraint. And Churchill was about to make a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Winston Churchill was not easily frightened by war. He had lived with it his entire adult life. He had watched empires collapse, governments fall, and entire generations vanish into the trenches. He understood violence, and he understood power. But what unsettled him now was not the presence of armies, it was the direction they were pointing. By late April 1945, reports arriving in London painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. Patton was restless. His commanders were asking questions that went beyond their orders. Timelines were being discussed that assumed continued movement east. Churchill recognized the pattern immediately. This was how wars began, not with declarations, but with momentum. The alliance with the Soviet Union had always been a marriage of necessity. Churchill had never trusted Stalin. He had warned Roosevelt repeatedly that Moscow's promises were tactical, not sincere. The Red Army's behavior in Eastern Europe had only confirmed his fears. Yet even Churchill understood that open confrontation in 1945 would be catastrophic. Britain was at the edge of exhaustion. Its population was war-weary. Its military stretched thin across the globe. The empire depended on stability, not escalation. And yet, Churchill could see events slipping beyond political control. Patton was not acting out of malice or ambition alone. He was acting out of conviction. And conviction, when paired with military power, had a way of dragging entire nations forward. Pressure along the borders. A slow, grinding escalation that could easily spiral out of control. And this time, there would be no clear enemy to rally against. The world would fracture into opposing camps before the last shots of the old war had faded. What made the situation even more alarming was the new reality of weapons. The United States possessed something no other nation had yet seen in action. A weapon of unprecedented destructive power, still wrapped in secrecy. Churchill knew of its existence. He understood its implications. If a war broke out now, it would not be fought like the last one. It would be fought with annihilation hanging over every decision. Churchill realized that Patton's proposal was not simply a military risk, it was a trigger. A trigger for a conflict that could end civilization as they knew it. This was the moment Churchill's thinking shifted. He stopped asking how to manage Patton. He began asking how to stop him. Churchill understood that direct confrontation with Patton would be ineffective. Patton respected strength, not caution. He would interpret hesitation as weakness and weakness as failure. Instead, Churchill turned to what he knew best, strategy. He began drafting memoranda, outlining the potential consequences of a Western push into Berlin. Not emotional appeals, cold calculations, casualty estimates, economic collapse, political fallout. He framed the issue not as a choice between courage and fear, but as a choice between endings. One ending concluded the war, the other ensured it would never truly end. Churchill also understood the delicate balance of American leadership. President Roosevelt was gone. Truman was new, inexperienced, and suddenly responsible for decisions that could reshape the world. This made the situation even more volatile. Patton's voice carried weight in Washington. His victories had made him a hero. His confidence was persuasive. And in moments of uncertainty, confidence could be dangerously attractive. Churchill knew that if Patton's argument gained momentum in the American... He spoke quietly, in private communications, in carefully worded messages that carried more weight than any speech. What he said was not meant to inspire, it was meant to restrain. The essence of Churchill's response was simple and devastating. If we march on Berlin, the war does not end. Churchill argued that taking the city would not be a final victory, but the opening move of another conflict. One that would begin with mistrust and end in catastrophe. He warned that the Soviets would not retreat peacefully from a city they believed they had earned with blood. And if they did not retreat, the Western Allies would face an impossible choice: fight or withdraw in humiliation. Churchill understood that neither option was acceptable. He reminded American leadership that the war had been fought to restore balance, not replace one form of domination with another. Marching on Berlin would not liberate Europe, it would divide it violently. More importantly, Churchill warned that the political consequences would outlive any military success. A Western occupation of Berlin would permanently poison relations with the Soviet Union. Any chance of cooperation, however fragile, would collapse. Europe would harden into armed camps overnight. He emphasized something Patton had never fully acknowledged. Wars do not end when armies stop moving. They end when enemies agree to stop being enemies. Churchill also addressed the unspoken assumption behind Patton's thinking, that a confrontation with the Soviets was inevitable, and therefore should happen sooner rather than later. Churchill rejected this logic entirely. An inevitable war, he argued, is still a choice when it comes to timing, and timing determines survival. To fight the Soviets now, in the ruins of Europe, with exhausted populations and uncertain political leadership, would risk everything Britain and America had just won. Churchill believed that delaying confrontation, even at the cost of influence, was preferable to triggering a war the world might not survive. Then came the line that would define his position. Churchill warned that if the Allies crossed into Berlin, they would be crossing more than a geographic boundary. They would be crossing the line between ending a war and starting one that could never truly be controlled. This was not fear speaking, it was experience. Churchill had watched Europe sleepwalk into catastrophe once before. He recognized the pattern of escalation, the false confidence, the belief that decisive action could impose order on chaos. He knew how those stories ended. What made Churchill's response especially powerful was that it did not deny Patton's logic. He did not argue that Patton was wrong about Soviet intentions. He argued that Patton was wrong about the price. Churchill accepted that Soviet expansion was dangerous. He accepted that Europe might one day face another conflict. But he believed that forcing that conflict in 1945 would destroy any chance of managing it. He believed that restraint now preserved options later. Patton saw restraint as surrender. Churchill saw it as survival. And in the end, Churchill's view prevailed. Orders were reinforced. Boundaries were respected. American forces halted their advance. Berlin was left to the Red Army. To the world, it looked like cooperation. To Patton, it looked like betrayal. But Churchill was not finished. Even as he argued against marching on Berlin, he was preparing for the possibility that his worst fears would come true. Because Churchill never confused restraint with trust. And what he did next would remain hidden for years. Publicly, the war was ending. Flags were raised, headlines celebrated victory. Leaders spoke of unity and rebuilding. The image presented to the world was one of cooperation, sacrifice rewarded with peace. Privately, Winston Churchill was preparing for a future he hoped would never arrive. Churchill had agreed not to march on Berlin. He had accepted the reality of Soviet occupation in Eastern Europe. But acceptance did not mean trust, and it did not mean passivity. While Patton fumed and American armies halted, Churchill ordered something extraordinary. He asked his planners a forbidden question. What if the Soviets turn on us? This was not a rhetorical exercise. It was not speculation for academic interest. Churchill wanted concrete answers, numbers, timelines, outcomes. The result was a plan so unsettling that it would remain classified for decades. Operation Unthinkable. The premise was blunt. If the Soviet Union broke its agreements and pushed further into Europe, could the Western Allies stop it by force? The answer the planners delivered was not comforting. On paper, the Soviets possessed overwhelming manpower. Their armies were massive, hardened by years of brutal warfare. Any conflict would be long, costly, and uncertain. Even with American industrial power and air superiority, victory was far from guaranteed. The plan went further. In one of the most controversial considerations, former German soldiers were again discussed as potential assets, not out of sympathy, but necessity. The logic was cold. Europe was already devastated, and fighting the Red Army without experienced ground forces might be impossible. This was the world Churchill was staring at, not peace, a suspended confrontation balanced on exhaustion and fear. Operation Unthinkable was never meant to be executed lightly. In fact, its very name reflected Churchill's understanding of the stakes. The plan existed as a warning, a recognition that the alliance could collapse without notice. Churchill hoped that by understanding the cost of war with the Soviet Union, he could avoid it. But for Patton, the existence of such planning only reinforced his belief. He felt vindicated. If Churchill was secretly preparing for conflict, then why not act while conditions were favorable? Patton's frustration deepened. He spoke more openly. His comments grew sharper. To him, the halt at Berlin represented a failure of nerve, a decision history would one day condemn. And Patton was not wrong about one thing. The peace that followed was uneasy. Soviet forces tightened their grip on Eastern Europe. Political opposition vanished. Borders hardened. Promises of free elections faded. The world was dividing, just as Patton had predicted. But what Patton underestimated was the cost of forcing that division at gunpoint. Churchill believed that delaying open conflict bought time. Time for rebuilding, for deterrence, for the development of new strategies that might prevent total destruction. Whether he was right remains debated. But one thing is certain. The restraint shown in 1945 did not come from ignorance or weakness. It came from a sober assessment of how easily victory could turn into annihilation. Patton would never accept this. His sense of betrayal would follow him into peacetime, isolating him from political leadership and placing him increasingly at odds with the world he had helped save. And soon, Patton would be gone, leaving behind a question that has never fully disappeared. What if he had been allowed to act? George Patton did not lose because he was defeated on the battlefield. He lost because the war he was fighting no longer matched the war the world was willing to continue. As Germany surrendered and celebrations spread across Europe, Patton found himself increasingly isolated. The qualities that had made him indispensable during total war, aggression, certainty, intolerance for compromise, became liabilities overnight. The rules had changed. Political leaders were no longer asking how to win. They were asking how to stop. Patton struggled with this shift. To him, halting momentum was unnatural. Armies were meant to advance, not freeze in place. Every instinct he possessed told him that hesitation invited disaster. But instincts were no longer enough. Patton's outspoken views alarmed both American and Allied leadership. His comments about the Soviets, once tolerated in private, now carried political consequences. The fragile post-war environment could not absorb his bluntness. Washington needed stability. Patton offered confrontation. President Truman, new to the role and already facing immense pressure, had little patience for unpredictability. Unlike Roosevelt, Truman did not have the same tolerance for Patton's theatrics or insubordination. And Patton did not adapt. He continued to speak openly about his belief that the wrong enemy had been defeated. He questioned the legitimacy of Soviet actions. He criticized the political decisions that restrained military action. In a world desperate to move forward, Patton seemed anchored to the logic of permanent war. Gradually, his influence diminished. Key decisions were made without him. His proposals went unanswered. His warnings were acknowledged and then ignored. This was not a judgment on Patton's competence. It was a recognition of incompatibility. The post-war world required containment, diplomacy, and patience. Patton believed in resolution through force. Those philosophies could not coexist. There was also another uncomfortable truth. Patton had become dangerous politically. A general advocating confrontation with a former ally risked triggering events no civilian leader could control. Allowing such a figure to shape policy would undermine democratic authority. So Patton was sidelined. His frustration turned inward. His diaries reflected bitterness, disbelief, and a sense of betrayal. He felt that the victory he had helped secure was being squandered by indecision and fear. History, he believed, would prove him right. Then, abruptly, Patton was gone. In December 1945, he died following a car accident in Germany. The circumstances were tragic, unremarkable, and final. With Patton's death, one of the loudest voices calling for immediate confrontation disappeared. The world moved on. But the debate he embodied did not. The Cold War emerged not as a sudden explosion, but as a slow hardening of lines, precisely the future Patton had warned about. Yet it emerged without the catastrophic war Churchill feared. This is the paradox at the heart of Patton's loss. He may have been right about the direction of history, but wrong about the moment to fight it. Churchill understood something Patton could not accept, that winning a war does not always mean using power to its fullest extent. Sometimes it means choosing not to use it at all. And that choice, more than any battle, defined the post-war world. History often disguises its turning points as decisions not taken. The March on Berlin was one of them. If Patton had been given permission, the initial outcome would likely have been swift. American forces were closer than many realized. German resistance in the West was collapsing. A rapid advance could have placed U.S. troops inside Berlin before Soviet forces fully consolidated control. The image would have been powerful. American flags over the Reichstag. Western commanders accepting the surrender of the German capital. A symbolic victory that reshaped the narrative of the war's end. But symbols have consequences. Stalin would not have interpreted this as a tactical move. He would have seen it as a deliberate challenge. A violation of trust at the exact moment when trust was already fragile. The immediate response might not have been open war. It would have been something more dangerous. Soviet forces would likely have refused to withdraw from surrounding territories. Supply routes could have been pressured. Incidents between patrols would have multiplied. Each side would test the other, searching for limits. And limits, once tested, tend to break. In this scenario, Berlin becomes a fault line. A city surrounded by Soviet-controlled territory, dependent on Western supply, vulnerable to blockade. A crisis waiting to happen, years earlier than it eventually did. The difference is timing. In 1945, nuclear weapons were few, untested in diplomacy, and terrifying in their novelty. Command structures were immature. Red lines were undefined. Any escalation carried an enormous risk of miscalculation. A single incident, a firefight, a misunderstanding, a hardline order, could have triggered a conflict neither side truly wanted, but neither side could stop. Europe, already shattered, would become the battlefield once again. Casualties would dwarf those of the closing months of the Second World War. Cities barely rebuilt would be destroyed anew. Civilian populations would bear the cost of ideological certainty. And there would be no clear victory. Even if the Western Allies prevailed militarily, the price would be generational. Political stability would collapse. Reconstruction would stall. The very idea of a peaceful Europe might never emerge. This is what Churchill saw. Not a cleaner victory, but a longer tragedy. The restraint of 1945 did not prevent conflict forever. The Cold War came. Tensions hardened. Proxy wars erupted across the globe. But Europe itself avoided immediate annihilation. The line between East and West was drawn without open war. That line was not inevitable. It was chosen. Patton believed that forcing the issue early would save lives later. Churchill believed that forcing it early might end the world. History cannot tell us with certainty which man was right, but it can show us the outcome of the choice that was made. A divided Europe, a cold peace, and a world that survived long enough to argue about it. The question remains not whether Patton could have taken Berlin. He almost certainly could have. The question is whether anyone could have controlled what happened next. Winston Churchill never claimed that the decision was clean. He never pretended it was heroic in the traditional sense. There were no parades for restraint, no monuments to battles that never happened. What he chose was not glory. It was survival. Churchill understood that power is most dangerous at the moment it feels justified. In 1945, the Western Allies had every reason to believe they could impose their will. They had momentum, legitimacy, and the moral weight of victory. That was precisely what frightened him. He had seen this before. Nations convincing themselves that decisive action would bring order, only to unleash forces they could not control. He knew that the end of one war often contains the seeds of the next. By stopping at Berlin, Churchill accepted a deeply uncomfortable truth. The world could not be fixed in one moment. It had to be managed. Restraint did not mean trust in the Soviet Union. It meant buying time to rebuild, to establish deterrence, to prevent misunderstandings from turning into annihilation. This decision shaped everything that followed. The Cold War became a contest of systems rather than armies. Fear replaced fire. Borders hardened, but cities remained standing. Europe recovered instead of burning again. None of this was guaranteed. It required leaders willing to accept incomplete victories. Patton represented the opposite impulse, the desire to finish what had been started, to remove uncertainty by force. That instinct is powerful and often necessary. But in 1945, Churchill believed it would be fatal. The restraint at Berlin did not erase conflict. It delayed it, contained it, and transformed it. Whether that was the right choice is still debated. But what is not debated is the scale of destruction that was avoided. The world did not slide directly from one world war into another. And that, more than any captured city, may have been the real victory. This moment reminds us that history is not only shaped by battles fought, but by battles refused. By decisions made in quiet rooms, by warnings whispered instead of shouted, by leaders choosing not to press every advantage. Patton demanded Berlin. Churchill said no, and in that refusal, the future bent. Just enough to keep the world intact.